Hi, and welcome to part 2 of our panel painting series. After the last episode, I cleaned up all the steel and then abraded it as I showed you before. So we've got the whole panel ready to paint now. Just a couple of things before we start. Wherever you've got windows and you've removed them, whether it's windows, portholes, just bear in mind that they've probably been put in or there's potentially silicone around them. So that's not a bad thing, just to get some silicone remover and just do a border around all the windows that you've removed, or any fixtures and fittings where you fear silicone may be present, and basically just removing it. Otherwise it'll affect your paint. You often can't see it in the primer coats, but as soon as you get to glossing it will react and then you get that fisheye in. So not a bad idea to go around those. Now I'm in a training situation, so I haven't papered up the apertures, but you need to. With the tumble home of the boat, as you're working, even if you're being careful, almost certainly you'll get paint dripping into the boat. So obviously seal that bit up. Now, although we've cleaned it all up, bearing in mind if this was a full boat, we'd have actually been walking around, standing on the gunnels. So potentially with greasy hands, mucky feet and so on, we could have contaminated the surface. The thing to do before we start any painting is just turn to some degreaser. I use a Fax Stacks in degreaser, and the idea is we're just going to, it sounds a big job, we're going to wash the boat over with this just to remove those greasy footprints or handprints or anything else which is on the boat. So that's what I'm going to do now. You might as well see it being done rather than have everything all ready before we start. So, as I say, it's a fast acting one. Just remember your PPE. A lot of these things will affect your skin. They can be an irritant. So pop a pair of gloves on and you should be fine. Again, as with all things, you know, if you're working outside and there's a chance of splashing, then you probably want some goggles on as well. Less likely for that to happen here, but certainly when it's windy and things like that, the last thing you want is anything getting splashed into your eyes. So if you've got any of those concerns, make sure you protect yourselves. Okay, I'm just using a bit of ordinary white cloth, fairly lint free, and you want a good dollop of degreaser. Now the trick is with the degreaser is to get it on so you can see the surface wet. You can almost see it, well, it is drying before your eyes, so get plenty on, give the steel a good clean, and before it's dry, just go over it with that other cloth just to dry the surface up. Now the reason for that is that one takes the muck off. This one is removing any residue that the degreaser has left behind. As it degreases, it sort of leaves a film, if you like. It's easy to remove, but just do it before it's dried and then you get a nice clean steel surface. And then just repeat the process. Once you get going, it's quite good to do this with two if there's two of you available, because one can be going ahead, knocking it, putting the degreaser on, and somebody else following, wiping it up before it dries too much. So there we go. Just get rid of that residue. And I did have somebody contact me and say, how long could you leave the steel prepped before you actually got to painting it? That's a bit like how long's a bit of string. It depends on the environment. I'm in a really dry environment, no moisture present. It's a week since we did this, and as you can see, there's no rusting, there's no effect to the actual steel itself, so you'd be fine. If this had been outside and it had rained, there's a good chance that, certainly where the surface has been broken, you'd start to get some rusting appeared. So the answer really is, if you can get a coat or something on it or be indoors, that's where you want to be. So, as I said, it's one of these jobs, it's good if you can get two of you on it. especially if you've got a 70-foot boat to do. But this will make all the difference to making sure that first coat, which is so important really, that it's going to adhere to the steel. There's not going to be areas where it's not sticking because there's grease or any other contaminants there that are stopping the paint from doing its job and adhering, or even drying properly. So that's that bit of steel cleaned up. I have to say, a lot of the time it doesn't look a lot different, but it gives you that peace of mind that we've got it cleaned and ready to take some paint. Now, the next thing to talk about, not really controversial, but it's how much, or how do we apply the paint, how much do we put on? It's back to your data sheets, look at the product you're using, it will tell you how many coats and the film thickness is to achieve. And straight away I get comments saying, people saying, well, how do we know how thick that is? So I'm going to go through a little process with you now, which hopefully will make it nice and simple. You use a wet film thicknessing comb. This is a simple little device. It's got teeth and two end blocks. The teeth are graded. So the idea is, once you put a coat of paint on here, by holding that onto the surface, some of the teeth will get a coating of paint, some won't, and by looking at that gradient, you'll be able to tell how much paint you're applying. Now, it's one of those things that you can do as you work along on your job, so you could keep that in the top pocket and keep checking as you go. After a little while, you'll get a feel for it. You can just have a little check as you go, but it's a very simple thing to use. It's quick. When I tend to do it, I'll usually just put the gauge on there like that, roll it across my glove, compare where the teeth are showing the paint or film thickness, and we're away. The next thing is the application. I would suggest, I mean, on this I'm just going to use a small roller. We tend to go up from the 4-inch that you've seen on some of my other videos. We tend now to use quite big rollers, get it on, but we do lay it off with a brush. We're just trying to make sure we get as nice and even and smooth a finish as we can, because we're going to build up 4-5 coats of primer, and if you're just knocking them on sort of fairly slapdash, by the time you put another 3 undercoats on top of that, you're in a position where, you know, if you're building in rough work, it just gets rougher and rougher, and when it comes to sanding, you'll end up sanding half the product off that you put on. So it's a fairly simple process. It's nothing that we've got to be too flash with. I've got a little trolley here that just makes life easier when you're working along on a flat surface. Just pull your trolley behind you. 4-inch high density foam rollers. Just bearing in mind, like anything with a paintbrush, when you first start, the roller's obviously dry. It takes a little while, or you have to move a bit of distance before you actually start to build some paint into the roller itself. You can sort of spend loads of time rollering it and working it. You might as well do it as you go, but just be aware, this is also where that thickness comb comes in quite handy, that where you first start, it's likely to be a little bit on the thin side. Now, I've only done a tiny bit there, and I'm going to apply some more paint because the roller is still absorbing paint, and for a time it actually takes the paint almost off again. It's like a sponge, so that's what it's doing. So don't be frightened to get in that paint tray a lot. Mistakes people make, especially with rollers, and why some people don't like using them or feel it's you know, not so good as a brush, is, and I'm going to do this on purpose now, it's very easy to use a roller, and as long as you can see the surface changing colour, which is how you do your front room, you know, away you go. Look, and I've managed to do quite a substantial area there. It's all turned grey, but I can assure you there's no paint there. Where I started here, and I've been going back in there with the roller, and again, I'm just doing this as a demonstration. A lot of people say, oh, you know, a roller. One thing with a roller, you can always go back to an area if you didn't think the paint was thick enough. So with your comb, you can test the thickness. So there's my comb. I can put that into the film of paint to see how thick it is. And as I said, you just roll it like that. I can see the teeth marks that are left behind, and that tells me I've got about 75 microns of paint. Now you probably can't see that, but that's what it's telling me is there. If I try it up here, just clean the teeth, I can actually see that the teeth have got no paint on them whatsoever. So it's below even 25 microns, which is absolutely nothing. So all I'm trying to do is just highlight the fact that whether it's a roller or a brush or whatever you're using, it's important to look at that film thickness as you go. It's so easy just to spread it out. You've got a nice grey boat, but you've got no paint on it. And part of this chemical process that's taking place is these paints need to be absorbed into the steel. They need to build up a surface, but it's all gauged against using the right film thickness. So 4 coats, it's 4 coats for a reason, so that we can build up a film thickness. And if we're doing it at, say, 75 microns per coat, those coats will dry out evenly over the next 24 hours, and when we come to put the next coat on, it's all dried thoroughly and it's as it should be. That's really important. The coats must dry out. If you start lashing it on with a brush or a bigger roller, or you're just not taking any care, you could come back the next day and the coating, although it's touch dry, is not actually dry to a proper film depth. Then when you put the next coat of paint on, it's just going to react. You're going to get all sorts of problems. You might get some crays in, and it's just not doing its job. So look at the data sheets and make sure that you follow the instructions. We're all very good at not reading the instructions on the tin, and we're all guilty of that. But it's easy to download a data sheet. It will give you the guidance that you need, and then we can get these coats of paint on. So I'm just going to carry on coating this, and I'll just show you what we do with this brush at the same time. So now, I did sort of let you know as I was doing it, you know, you can always go back over an area if you felt that you didn't get enough paint on, and we know I spread this one out. So there we are, I can go straight back over that and get some more paint on, no problem at all. Now a rollered finish, you could leave, you know, your whole boat, you can do the whole boat in a rollered finish, and that would be absolutely fine. The reason that we just lay it off with a brush is if there are any little air bubbles, anything like that, the brush is actually just taking those out, bursting the bubbles if you like, and just filling the hole that a bubble would leave. Now this is another reason why we look at putting on multiple coats. If you just say, well, they said they want 100 microns or whatever it might be, and you try and get all that on in 2 coats, any air bubbles that are bursting, and using rollers and things like that, you create, even the stirring of the paint will create to a degree some air pockets. If you try to do that in 2 coats, there is always the potential that when bubbles burst or there's any little discrepancy in your paintwork, that will actually make basically a wormhole through to the steel. You've got a tunnel, if you like, where the paint will actually just, it'll look covered, except more in a microscopic version. There'll be actually a channel leading back down to the steel. Now if that's the case and moisture gets in there, then obviously we've got a problem then with moisture getting to the steel surface, and potentially rusting is going to occur. So That's why we use multiple coats. We build the coats up for drying purposes and also to make sure that we've got the integrity of the coatings as we will want them. Now, I'm using International Yacht Primer. It's what I use on all the boats we use. This is an aluminium based, or the solids in this paint are aluminium flake. One of the reasons I use it is, A, you can see it's nice stuff to use. It's very simple application wise, it goes on very smooth, leaves you a nice finish. But also it's compatible with whatever materials you might be using. So if I've got wooden cratches, cratch boards and so on, then this stuff is perfectly okay to prime bare wood, aluminium and so on. So again, just check the data sheet, but it's a sort of all-purpose primer. Extremely good. It's not the cheapest on the market. It is also quite resilient as far as moisture. So if you were working outside, you've got your boat painted, and obviously come the evening, we get a bit of evening dew, you know, a bit of condensation, that sort of thing. This primer is very good at withstanding any sort of damp. I'm not suggesting, you know, you try and do this in the rain, but it's quite forgiving stuff. So another good reason to use this type. There are other ones out there. Probably the most common sort of primer is a zinc phosphate based primer. They can be a little bit susceptible to moisture. So you would probably want to pick the time of day that you're doing it. You want to make sure that, you know, it's fully dry before the evening time comes if you're working outside. Because as I said, they are a little bit susceptible to moisture. And if you obviously get moisture in, or you're concerned that there is moisture forming on your paintwork, then the next day when it comes to reapplying your next coat, you're going to have to leave it in the sun or in the wind and make sure that it is actually dried right out. Otherwise you're going to trap that moisture in the next layer. And if you've heard of things like micro blistering and these various problems that paintwork can suffer, a lot of that can be entrapment of moisture during the painting process. So again, it's a reason to, you know, use good primers in the best conditions that you can. And this is why I tend to stick with this one. Now, a painting process means not only the primer coats, but also the undercoats that we're going to apply as well. And one thing with International where you can't really go wrong is if you use their painting process, it's very, very compatible. So I'm applying this primer coat. Tomorrow I can come in, and I will come in and apply another one. There's no rubbing down required. If you're working outside, maybe just wipe off any dust or anything that might have accumulated on the surface, but there'd be no rubbing down. You just get your roller out and away you go, straight on top of what's already there. And depending on the conditions, you can do that for 1 or 2 or 3 days after the first coat went on. So there is a weather window there of while that process will still work. Check your data sheets. Once you've gone outside 3 or 4 days, depending on weather conditions, you would have to rub the primer down. Part of the reason we use this primer is you don't have to rub it down between coats. So it's always a good idea to plan your project, give yourself the opportunity so that you can put 4 or 5 coats of primer on in 4 or 5 days, and then that's your priming finished and you've had to do no rubbing down in the meantime. Now, ideally, if you can do it, give yourself a little bit more time, because the International range of paints allows this primer to be overcoated with a pre-coat, which is basically an undercoat. You don't have to rub the primer down before you put the undercoat on, again, as long as you stay within this time frame for drying. So in 7 days, you could actually have 4 primers, 3 undercoats, leave that to dry for a good period of time. We usually leave it about 72 hours. And then you're ready then to start machining down for your gloss coats. So all in all, that's a cracking little system. It's the one we use. It allows us to build those coats up over a period of time. And then the only rubbing down we'll do is the undercoat ready for the gloss coats. So you couldn't really have a more simple system. If you do have to leave the primer, you don't have that time frame to work with, then of course you would have to rub it down, which is a time-consuming process. It's something that on a 70-foot boat, you know, that's a lot of rubbing down to do, because it's the front, the back, the sides, the roof, everything. As I say, time-consuming, but you're paying good money, 45, 50 pounds a tin, whatever it might be. You've used no ends of tins of paint, probably on a 50-odd, 60-odd foot boat, you'd be looking to use 8, 9, 10 tins of paint, depending on the solid content and the thicknesses you've achieved. When you get to the end of that, if you leave it to dry and you've gone outside that, if you like, time frame, you're going to be rubbing off half the product that you've put on, getting a key for that undercoat to go on. So you're wasting the product you've put on. You've also reduced the film thickness that you achieved. So if you've gone over this, you're quite comfortable that you've got we work to 120 microns, you've got your 120 microns of paint on there. Then you rub it down, you could have rubbed it back down to 50, 60, 70, whatever in places. And if anything, it's not going to do the job it was designed to do. So think about it. If you can work that way, prime, 4 coats. Before we do when we do the next episode, I will just show you there is a little device you can use just to check that when it's all dry, you've actually got the film thickness required. So we'll have a look at that when I can actually test this bit of steel and you can see what we've managed to achieve. So I'm going to leave this to dry. I'll come in the morning, we'll give it another coat of paint, the following day another coat, and so on. So we'll build those coats up, and then we'll just give you a quick look at the finished primer surface, and then I'll go on to the undercoating for the next stage, so you can see how that changes, and we'll just discuss that. So the idea is over these next few episodes, we're going to build this panel up until it's a complete glossed finish, but I'll take you through the stages as we go. So we'll pick that up when I come next time, and if you're following me through with this, go and get your paintbrush out. Catch you later. Bye.